Good afternoon. Welcome to the Q&A session. If you're in Australia, you're probably hot, unless you're in a nice shady space, or in an air-conditioned room perhaps. It's very hot outside. All the kangaroos have disappeared under the trees. They know what's best. If we weren't here in the hall, the kangaroos would be on the veranda of the hall on a day like today. But they're a bit shy, so they've gone into the forest. So the first question this afternoon is from Eric in Australia. Is it useful or a hindrance to see meditation as a way to more easily feel emotions that may be repressed? Depends what you mean by more easily feel. Some of our emotions are negative. It's one way we translate the term kilesa, often more commonly translated as mental mental defilement, but could be called negative emotion. So like anger, fear, anxiety, lust, jealousy. So emotions that are accompanied by feelings of sadness, depression, agitation, discomfort, both mental and physical. So when you say more easily feel, I guess it's correct in one sense. It's because you're practicing mindfulness. As your mind settles down, things do surface that have been there, suppressed before. Now you're more calm. They do tend to surface sometimes all by themselves. You don't have to make things surface. They're attachments or clinging, things that you've identified with based on memory, perception, past experience as well. They sometimes resurface. So a very common one is a memory of a traumatic event or of a person or a place that brings up anger. So when that memory surfaces, it brings with it an unpleasant feeling, and this triggers some kind of mental defilement. So it could be fear, anxiety, anguish, grief. So it is part of the process of meditation. It's certainly not the only point of meditation, but it does happen as you go along the path. Things surface, and so you're learning to deal with them correctly and wisely. So using both mindfulness and compassion and wisdom and patience, because some things are really deeply ingrained in our subconscious, depending on the strength of the clinging, how long it's been there. So you could have been sitting on some anger for years towards a person, and normally you don't think about it, so it's just under the surface, but it's still there. And when the conditions are right, it pops up. And sometimes those conditions are, you're just sitting on your own, meditating, but the mind naturally is a kind of detox, mental detox, so things can come to the surface. Even though there's no external trigger, it's actually because you're more peaceful and it's like you're noticing something that you may have vaguely been aware of or knew was there, but now it's surfacing and you notice it. And the idea is to be patient, compassionate, mindful, and work on letting it go, in the sense of not building on it or letting it continue to cause mental proliferation and further suffering. So your goal is to end suffering in meditation. So it may mean accepting things that are hard to accept, feelings of guilt, anguish, not always easy to be with. It takes calm, mindful witnessing, you say, witnessing of whatever the emotion is, but then not letting it overwhelm the mind and create more suffering. And when we're not very mindful, we often do that. We start reliving things, rehashing, going over old stuff, making more suffering again, sometimes over memories of events that happened years ago. And that's just a habit. That's one reason maybe why we suppress stuff. It's just too difficult to be with those emotions and those thoughts and memories. But meditation can be this kind of detox where you mindfully acknowledge things and you change your view. And one thing that mindfulness does, the more mindfulness you have, you can look at your own experience of body, mind, feelings, thoughts, memories with a more detached awareness. And you can see the trail of cause and effect that's led up to this feeling that's emerging, but at the same time you can also step back from it. Say, okay, it's a feeling, but ultimately it's not a self, it's not me, it's one temporary mental state. And when you see like that, your whole view or attitude towards it changes. Often it's less overwhelming because you know it's just a feeling, it's just an emotion. And you can see the more you cling to it and identify with it, you suffer. So your own mind is teaching you, don't cling to it, let it go, let it be. However painful, difficult, you let it be, and that will start to heal the mind, and maybe that whole event, the way it affects you changes, and you still have a memory, but you no longer have the strong emotion with the memory. Lust is another form, slightly different, but you can have sexual desire and lust arise based on past experiences, and that sometimes does come up in meditation because you're quiet, so your mind's looking for something, so it'll fantasize and proliferate about old sexual encounters and things that have brought up strong desire, strong emotions of love, romance, etc. Again, it's surfacing because it's there underlying in your consciousness, but normally you're too busy or thinking too much for it to surface, but now you're more quiet in your meditation, well then it can surface. Or sometimes you're just looking for something to think about, distract yourself with, so it could be, say, feelings of romance, love, sexual desire. But again, your aim is to establish mindfulness. You know the feeling, you know the thoughts with it, but you're seeing them as temporary mental states that arise and pass away. And with strong mindfulness you can do that. And also using wisdom to reflect on whatever it is that's proliferating the mind, conditioning the mind, whether it's attraction or aversion or fear. You're bringing them to be seen as mental states that are not self, not me, not mine. And it's not just a casual, oh, this isn't mine, the feeling you have in your mind, this isn't me. You can't do it like that. It's from sustained, continuous mindfulness and then investigation of the Dhamma, recognizing the craving and the clinging that is coming up with that mental state, that experience, and recognizing that's the cause of suffering, so then to abandon it, let it go, let it be. And meditation involves a lot of that done repetitively, because kilesas are stubborn, our attachments are stubborn. Craving is the longest river in the world, the Buddha said, longer than any other river. In that sense, it just seems endless, but it does have an end. But we have to keep practicing mindfulness and seeing the impermanent, selfless nature of craving and the objects of craving. So I hope that gave you some help. So another question from Singapore. Lumpur, can I check how does one know that she is ready to live a homeless life? if a lady was to ordain, where and how can she ordain? Seems like it is more difficult for a lady to do so compared to a man. Seeking your advice on this. Yeah, I agree. There's definitely more opportunities for men in the world, but the number of opportunities for women to ordain in Buddhist monasteries, nunneries, is growing. So that's good sign. There's some countries and some Buddhist traditions already have established lines of Buddhist monastics, nuns. So in Thailand they have the more traditional white-robed 8-precept nuns. There's lots of them in Thailand, and often associated with teachers and monasteries who, most of the teachers are male, of course, but there are female teachers as well, nuns who teach and run and lead monastic communities. There's a small, growing bhikkhuni community in Thailand, but it is still quite new. Then Sri Lanka also has traditional nuns communities, sometimes independent, sometimes associated with monasteries for monks. Burma, the same. Most Theravada and Mahayana countries will have nuns communities. I once visited Taiwan, and they have a lot of very large, well-established nuns communities, and very impressive, the practice they do. The senior nuns seem to be very wise, as you would be if you practice a disciplined life in a monastery, whether it's Theravada or Mahayana, over a long period of time. You can't help but become wiser as a human being, and generally you become more compassionate. So my visits there brought me to meet small nuns communities. So if you're somebody who likes a very small community of 2 or 3 on a hillside where you've got peace and quiet, time to meditate more, or large communities where they have lots of chanting and meditation sessions, as well as going out to do service for the community. Anyone who knows Taiwan will know the nuns there do lots of social work, printing Dhamma books, helping the sick, the poor, different social activities, raising funds for disaster relief, and on it goes. They do a lot of good work. Korea has tradition of Buddhist nuns. In the West, there are smaller and growing nuns communities, both Theravada and Mahayana, in Australia and in many other countries as well. So, although the opportunities are a bit more limited, it's really up to you to seek out a teacher and a community, and I would recommend to find a teacher. It's hard to learn on the run as a nun or a monk. You need a teacher. It's the best. What we call Kalyana Mitta, somebody who's already practiced, understood how to practice well, and can pass on that experience and set a good example. I'd recommend that's the best starting point. So go around, search around online and then in person to see what's available. That's what I did. I mean, I'm a man, and as I said, more opportunities for men, but when I started, I didn't know much about anything, so I just traveled to Thailand with a wish to find a good teacher, and my wish was fulfilled within 7 days. Not quite 1 day, but 7 days. I found Ajahn Chah, and I was lucky. It really is up to us, isn't it? But what motivates you to do that, say for me, was a strong desire to practice meditation and practice the Buddhist path in a peaceful setting with a teacher, because I could see that would give me the maximum opportunity to develop wisdom and understanding and do the best for myself and for other people as well. And to be successful as a monastic, you've got to want to be a monastic. You can't be forced to do it, not for very long. You can't do it on a whim. You can't kind of slip into it and stay your life in a monastery just by sort of, seeing what it's like. You can do that for a little while. You really want to be a monk or a nun if you're going to do it long term and really get results. So for myself, I was practicing meditation every day, keeping precepts, listening to Dhamma, reading Dhamma as a student. And I could see there's so many drawbacks to practicing the Dhamma in lay life. I just wanted to be in a monastery. Even though I knew it would be difficult in a monastery, and I had my own attachments, and I knew there'd be challenges, I wanted to do it. So it was just a natural step to go to a monastery. And because there was that desire, what we call chanda, kusala chanda, wholesome desire, it made it easy to face the challenges and just do it, and without getting too caught up into doubts. And because I found a good teacher, that also helped to allay doubts and just give me the encouragement just to keep practicing and try it. And I haven't been disappointed, and I haven't looked back. Some of the Buddhist nuns I've met and known, they sort of the same. They were probably practicing before as a layperson, and they realized it's just so difficult as a layperson to really commit to the practice because you have other responsibilities, duties. It's more limited. So there's that wish to commit more to the training and the practice. So then there's a wish to move into a monastic lifestyle. And again, finding teachers often is a vital factor in that, a good teacher. And some people have amazing obstacles that they have to overcome. Their family ties and obligations. And some people are married and have to get their husband's blessing, and that's hard, or their parents' blessing. And the same for monks as well. Parents, family members are not always supportive. Those kind of emotions come up very strongly when someone says, I want to be a nun or I want to be a monk. Suddenly all these emotions that you've never knew were there suddenly emerge out of nowhere. So one has to be strong and committed, but cautious as well, because some people think it's a good idea to become a monk or a nun, and they want to do it based on their ideal, but when the time comes, they're not really ready for it. They may have still a lot of attachment to comfort and sensual desire, or for intimacy with a partner, because as a monastic you're celibate. Some people are still very caught up in the world, and so they're just not peaceful when they go into a monastic environment, and they keep missing home, thinking of more worldly things and they can't overcome. So the ones who tend to do better long term are the ones who develop some peace in their meditation and in some wisdom, which is enough to counter or quieten the doubts or the desires to go back to the lay life. And you meet some women who are almost like nuns in the lay life already, in the sense that they already have a higher understanding of what is good and evil, good and bad karma, and they're trying to train themselves, and they're tired of many of the worldly activities of family life or earning a living, social things, cultural things, politics, and all the things that lay life is mixed up with. They're tired of all that, so they're ready for the monastic life. So many of Ajahn Chah's nuns, they already had faith in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. They may already be attending monastery, sometimes practicing meditation, keeping 8 precepts sometimes, doing retreats or spending short periods in a monastery. Then when they felt ready, they cleared up their business, then they moved into the monastery. That's a very common pattern, is the sort of gradual movement towards monastic life by doing it in short bursts first, living temporarily on 8 precepts in a monastic setting. And obviously with a good teacher like Ajahn Chah, then people would have confidence to take up the nun's life with him, and in many other situations. You may have read the biography of Meiji Gel, one of Ajahn Mun's female disciples, who's believed to be an enlightened nun, Arahant. And she had great struggles to give up the lay life, not because of herself. She really wanted to be a nun and practice meditation, but her family first and then later her husband didn't want her because he wanted a wife in the more traditional sense. So she went to the monastery first for a few months for the rains retreat, and then came back. And because her mind was so committed to the practice, she kept her nun's robes on under her normal household work clothes, which already got her husband a bit annoyed. And she wanted to live more or less like a nun, but at home, because that's the way her mind was. It already inclined to the monastic life. But the husband was obviously very upset by that. He just wanted a wife, children, start family, build up the family, home and so on. So he was getting very annoyed with her and would argue with her and scold her. And eventually her brother saw that it could become a difficult situation. So he just said, look, just go to the monastery. And the husband was very angry, but he could see it's just suffering to live with a wife who wants to be a nun, so he let her go. So some people have to go through a lot of difficulty, but if there's that commitment, then that leads them on. If the commitment is not strong, then I'd recommend just trying short times in monastic settings. See what it's like, see if you find peace in your meditation, peace in the lifestyle, before making a full commitment. Because, as I said, sometimes we're driven by ideals. We think it's a good idea, but we're not ready for it yet. And you can only find out by trying, but you maybe try temporarily first. Question from Australia. Dear Lumpur, could you please explain the difference between following the breaths when practicing Samadhi, when practicing Vipassana? The funny answer is, well, the breath doesn't know that you're practicing Samadhi or Vipassana. The breath is just going in and out, because the breath is impersonal, it's just air. And it just goes on all day long, whether you know it or not, whether you call it Vipassana or Samatha. And it's how you intend your mind, how you determine your mind as you're doing your meditation. So most people's mindfulness in the beginning of practice is patchy. It's not constant. We have it and then we lose it. So we do a lot of time, a lot of practice to bring up mindfulness in a more continuous way, using the breath as an object. You focus your mind on the feeling of the in and out breath, you pay attention to it, you let go of what we call the 5 hindrances. So at first you may not be intending your mind to develop insight into the 3 characteristics of existence, which is the main way we describe Vipassana, which is clearly seeing the impermanent nature of physical mental phenomena, seeing the unsatisfactory, imperfect nature of physical mental phenomena, seeing the selfless nature of physical mental phenomena. So directing one's attention to seeing these 3 characteristics, or particularly one of the 3, and the most common one might be impermanence. So contemplating, observing, seeing impermanent nature of physical form, feelings, memories, thoughts, sense contact, sense consciousness. And the one thing to remember is, even if you're calling your practice samatha, you're just developing mindfulness on a single object to calm the mind, develop tranquility, and then attain some samadhi, which tends to happen sooner or later, more or less samadhi. Even if you call that samatha or just developing samadhi, you will also gain some wisdom and insight as you do it. And the Buddha said, samadhi and wisdom, they develop together, even though you may be focusing particularly on developing samadhi and strengthening your mindfulness. which is what samadhi is. It's the continuous presence of mindfulness. You also notice things. You notice thoughts coming and going. So you're practicing what we call samatha meditation. To one point in the mind, develop a state of samadhi. The rapture comes up, the letting go of sense objects comes up. But you're also noticing as you go, aren't you? You notice the impermanent nature of thoughts and feelings and sense objects. So you're already beginning your vipassana practice, except for you're maybe not fully directing your mind to that practice at the moment if you're developing just mindfulness of the breath. And traditionally, when your mind becomes calm in samadhi and the hindrances have subsided, the obstacles to samadhi have fallen away, then your mind is in the best position to practice vipassana. But as I said, on the way along the journey, you're also noticing impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self. But that noticing of those qualities is perhaps not yet very clear. It's just transient. It's mixed with just noting things. It's not yet the mind completely seeing and abandoning craving yet. It's just noticing the characteristics, and it's a sort of preparation or training for vipassana. But when your mind is totally clear, mindfulness is very continuous, then there's an opportunity to really see the delusions coming up in your experience and see through them. So the delusion of permanence, which covers over impermanence, or the delusion of happiness in something which is actually unsatisfactory and dukkha, or the delusion of self, the clinging to an idea of self in your experience, which covers over the selfless nature of experience. You know, every bit of vipassana is kind of peeling back layers of delusion, wrong views, delusions, and exposing the truth underneath, which is liberating. So it depends on firm mindfulness to do that well, and that's why samadhi plays this role. But it doesn't mean to say you can't do it from the beginning of your practice. You're also doing it, and sometimes we just practice a bit of vipassana, don't we? You know, we don't feel we have much samadhi yet. Our mindfulness is still a bit up and down, in and out. But you can experiment and try some vipassana, and people do this. And some people, particularly, they do vipassana directed to their body, using thought, images, reflections to the point where they're really focused on the body, visually, on the sensations of the body, and it turns into samadhi. And it can happen that way. So there is room for experimentation here. It's not like there's just one, absolutely only one way that you develop samadhi and then vipassana. There's room for some creativity based on your character and what your mind inclines towards. And sometimes you also have the experience of just insight arising by itself due to prior effort of developing mindfulness and contemplating something. When the situation is right, the conditions are right, insight seems to just emerge out of nowhere. That happens as well. And of course it's not emerging out of nowhere, there are causes and conditions that have led up to it, but it seems to just be prompted almost by very little at all. Just suddenly your mind becomes very aware of the impermanent nature of body or feelings, thought formations, views we're holding, and something may drop away, or you have some breakthrough and some greed or anger or delusion seems to drop away. And that can happen in unexpected moments, because you can't predict your life ahead, what's going to happen exactly from day to day, moment to moment. But the practice you do is preparing for possible insights that may arise. And when the conditions are right, they just come up. So it could be just hearing the news about something happening in another part of the world, but your mind turns away from craving and realizing that something that you were holding on to dearly as self is not really self. It's something you have to let go of. It's impermanent. Or seeing some anger that you were holding on to as your mind is quiet enough to really see that this is craving and attachment and it's causing suffering, it's best to just let it go from the mind. Even though another part of the mind was holding on dearly to that anger and that view for a long time, now there's another part, the part of Vipassana, says, no, this is suffering, and it lets it go. Right, there really are very, very many different ways that Vipassana insight can seem to come up, sometimes just sort of automatically by itself. So sometimes it'll be informal sitting, walking meditation. It's the most common, you might say. Other times it's just in a more informal situation, but the mind is in the right space and just has a real insight. And, you may be sitting on a bus or going to work and your mind is calm and you just look at people or the activities around you and the mind withdraws into a place of peace and realize everything in this world is impermanent. The job you do, the people who do that job with you, the people on the street going here, going there, none of them last. The buildings and the things we create in this world, none of it lasts. And you have a deep insight, and insight tends to be followed by peace. Piti and sukha arise just in the same way as the factors of samadhi arise from samatha practice, focusing on a single object. Piti, sukha, one pointedness also arises from vipassana, and the mind can become very blissful from insight and wisdom. It certainly is not becoming depressed. The words in Pali are often a little bit hard to translate, so they use the word nibbida, is like turning away or becoming tired of attachment to the world, turning away from the world, and it seems almost like aversion for the world, but it's not aversion, it's a natural seeing through delusion and the mind dropping its attachment, because it's tired of attaching and suffering with attachment, so it's tired of that, it drops that, turns away. And that can happen at different moments, and a little bit of something that the mind was holding on to seems to literally dissolve or drop away. A way of looking at the world. Seeing your body, as something that you got to really hold on to, and you're always trying to make it strong and look good, and then one day you just realize, but it's just a collection of four elements that get old, sick and die. Maybe your view or your attitude towards your physical body changes. That could be gradual, or it could be, you might have one moment of real clear insight. So there's plenty of room for different experiences in this, and remember that with the techniques we learn in Buddhism, they're the basics, but try not to attach too rigidly to technique itself, because sometimes you need to be looking at your own practice, your own character, and how your mind is developing in the practice, and there may be room for different insights, and sometimes teachers help us as well. They point out things that we haven't seen before ourselves. Question from Singapore. What are unwholesome objects? Well, we usually say unwholesome mental states. We make unwholesome karma by following mental states rooted in the unwholesome roots of greed, anger, and delusion, as opposed to the wholesome roots of non-greed, non-anger, and non-delusion. So in a way you could say there are no such things as unwholesome objects. Objects are just objects. So if we're talking about things you see, hear, touch, smell, taste, or even thoughts that arise, in a way you can say, well, they're just neutral. They're just things the mind knows. Sense contact, data, sense data. But what happens is, due to this conditioning process and our karma, they give rise to feeling. You see something, there's pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and then that will give rise to craving. If there's no awareness, no mindfulness, no wisdom, it tends to be quite an automatic process. So, for example, you have a painful feeling in your knee or your leg, and you get a little bit of mental aversion to that. The painful feeling itself is just a painful feeling, but then your craving arises, saying, I don't like this, don't want this. Maybe it leads to a little bit of mental proliferation. So it's an unwholesome mental state of craving, which conditions clinging. Craving hardens into views based around what you like, what you don't like, what you identify with as self. So unwholesome and wholesome is generally towards the state of mind, the mental state. And you can see, one object, as in a sense object, seeing something. Say you see a person, can give rise to different reactions in people. Like if this person that's walking down the street towards you is your friend, you might have a thought of metta or goodwill or happiness seeing your friend coming towards you. So you're just seeing the form, you recognize the form, and then these perhaps more wholesome states arise. Or it could be one of sexual attraction or desire or attraction, which is unwholesome reaction based on seeing the same thing, same person. Or it could be someone you've had trouble with before and you now consider them an enemy. So as soon as you recognize who it is, aversion, anger, ill will arises. So it's the same person, but you could have three different reactions, different wholesome or unwholesome mind states may be triggered on the seeing of that person. And that's why we say the mind is a conditioned thing. One thing leads to another. It's not like that person was born your friend or your enemy, as it were. This is what we add on to our experience because of ignorance, conditioning, craving, and attachment. We like things or we don't like things through the experience and the way we interpret it and what happens, we add this on. So then it can become habitual reactions to things. So like, say there's this kind of food you really like. Well, it could become a basis for gluttony. You're always getting it and eating it and thinking about it and enjoying it and buying more and storing it and stockpiling it and pigging out on it. For one person, because they built up an attachment and identification with that kind of food. Another person may just be very ordinary towards it. It's just food, it's okay, but it's nothing great. If I have it, good. If I don't, never mind. And another person might hate it. Same food, same object, but the perception, the attachment that comes up is different. So this is the sort of thing you're learning as you meditate. You become more mindful. You're seeing your reactions, and you see the value of mindfulness, so you can catch your reactions and see what's going on in your mind, and see craving arise in different ways, and how that leads on to suffering. So the noble ones, because they've trained in Vipassana, they've trained in Sila, their Sila is very pure, they've trained in Vipassana, their mindfulness is good, they have Samadhi, they have wisdom, and they've trained in that. Even something very unpleasant, they turn it into something that is wholesome in the sense they apply mindfulness and wisdom to every experience, even a bad experience. Whereas the unenlightened person tends to, because they're not well trained, turn even good experiences into something more unwholesome because of their mind. If it's something pleasant, well, they attach to the pleasant nature of that experience, they want more of it, and becomes a basis for that kind of desire. Something unpleasant becomes a basis for aversion, negativity, even hatred. That's the trouble with the unenlightened mind. It's not well trained yet, whereas the enlightened or nobleman's mind is well trained, so they don't create suffering out of their experience. But in terms of experience through our senses, objects are pleasant, unpleasant in their characteristic, in their nature, but then what we do to that is where the suffering and the craving, the attachment, the suffering comes from. So it's not to say there aren't pleasant experiences in the world, unpleasant experiences, painful experiences in the world. There are, but then how do you deal with them? So the noble ones, and particularly the arahant, has no more suffering, so they don't create craving or attachment out of their experience. So, they know an ugly, horrible experience, horrible sight, horrible sound, taste, as that, but there's no craving or attachment to it. Nothing unwholesome arises in their mind over that, the contact with that kind of sense object, even if it's painful. So, an arahant or the Buddha would still have pain, but nothing unwholesome in the mind arises over that pain. We have pain, we don't like it, so we complain about it and get annoyed by it and fear it and hate it. That's the difference. The unenlightened person and the enlightened person behave differently towards the normal experiences of the world. What's the difference? It's the training, the practice. They've done the practice, so they're no longer caught into craving, attachment and suffering. Question from Australia. Dear Luang Por, my question is if it's possible for us to be deviated from the path by ghosts or lower realm devas with whom we may have connections with from our current or past lives, or is it always due to our own ignorance and karma? Will knowing change the way we practice towards the path? My gratitude to you for your compassion to teach us so generously and tirelessly. Yeah, it's a very common response in Asia in particular. Blame the ghosts and the devas for everything. Or spells. Somebody put a spell on me, so I'm not doing well in my job, or my love life's no good. They put a spell on me, a curse on me. The Buddha really encourages us to sort of set aside that kind of belief. It's not to say there's absolutely no truth in it. It's just set it aside, go to what's more useful. Like you say, ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. When there's ignorance in the mind, we create and follow craving, which creates clinging, which creates birth and suffering, karma. And so that's a better starting place, a more solid ground to start your investigation of why you're having problems. What karma are you making today? You make choices. And this is not to say that there are maybe beings around in the world, good and bad ones, but they're very difficult to verify, prove, aren't they? And you may even weaken your own intelligence by just believing what someone else says. So you go to some spiritual person, they say, oh, you've got a ghost bothering you, and you're stuck, you need to do some special ceremony. Okay, there may be some truth to that, but there may not. You're prey to someone else's words there. If you haven't got direct evidence yourself, you have to be careful not to believe too easily. But where you can easily see how things are going, look at your own mind, your own attitudes, the way you act, the way you speak, the choices you make. Are you acting with greed towards the world and the way you do things, with anger, selfishness, jealousy, rage? If you're getting angry with everyone and abusing them and arguing with them and forming poor relationships with people, well, if you're doing business, of course your business is going to go downhill. And you can say, oh, it's the ghost from past life, but it's probably more likely that you're just being too argumentative and uncooperative with the people you work with and trade with, isn't it? There are often very obvious reasons for success, failure, happiness, sadness that you can really quickly come to terms with and learn about through the practice of meditation. How you relate to your partner, your children, your parents, your friend, your enemy. So investigation of ignorance and karma would be a good starting place. As far as beings in other realms, well, perhaps a good starting point is just practice sharing merits, developing goodwill and sharing merits. If there are beings in other realms, wish them well, may they be well, just as you do with other human beings that you can see. You know. The people you meet in your daily life, if you try to be honest, kind, friendly with them, even if they're not friendly themselves, but you try to develop these wholesome actions and speech, generally that's the way to go, isn't it? And if you find people are very mischievous or troublemaking for you, well, you do your best to avoid them, or be patient if you can't avoid them, and just be careful with them if they're out to get you, or you have to be a bit careful, of course. So that's how you behave with humans. So if you think there's a ghost around in your life, treat it the same way. Sympathize with it. You know, ghosts are beings in lower realms, realms of suffering. So if you really think you're connected to a ghost and they deserve your compassion, share merits with them, wish them well, wish them to gain a good rebirth. So no real difference from human beings. And there's many different kinds of humans in this world, and we just carry on and do the best we can. Beings in other realms, the same. With the devas, they say, do a lot of good, and the devas can be rejoicing in the good you do. So you don't have to think too much about this. Just carry on practicing the path that you've learned, and listen to the Dhamma often, reflect on the Dhamma often. Develop generosity, sila, meditation, reflect on the Dhamma, and this is going to improve your mind, and other people benefit from it, whether it's people around you, people further away, or beings in other realms. They're all going to benefit. Another question. Dear Ajahn, how to overcome the obsession for the sense pleasures of food? And if one has been practicing celibacy for a long period of time and had a sexual thought arise, is that a fallback in the practice, or is it part of the journey? Well, to abandon sexual desire, lust, craving based on attachment to the body, only anagamis and arahants have done that. So you are in for the long haul. Be patient. But keep developing the practice of what we call Gaya Gada Sati, mindfulness of the body, mindfulness directed to the body, to counter the obsession and the sort of taking for granted of the body as being something beautiful, attractive, and stimulating sexual desire. Yeah. Look at all the unattractive bits, often, in yourself or in others. And you can imagine it, or you just look in real life. Smell those unpleasant smells, notice them when you do, in yourself or others. The human body is constantly producing odors, unpleasant odors, producing excretions, even just like grease in the hair. It smells, it makes the hair unpleasant. Grease on the skin, sweat, snot, mucus, earwax, excrement, urine. On and on we can go. This is an ongoing practice, and little by little you're bringing up those perceptions to counter the obsession with the beautiful, the attractive, which is the basis for sexual desire. But it's a practice you have to gradually develop these perceptions. And of course, as you're doing it, well, lust will come up from the other side. The opposite of mindfulness of the body will be attraction for the body, stimulating lust, sexual desire, as well as just general sensuality, attraction for pleasant things, beautiful things. This is not going to disappear just like that. So the aim is to develop more mindfulness and contemplate it with wise reflection. See the limits and the drawbacks and the dangers of attachment and different kinds of desires and attachments. And then the Buddha said, look for the release, the way out. And the way out of sexual desire is contemplating the unattractiveness of the body, the impermanence of the pleasure coming from sexual attraction. That's one. But also don't be too hard on yourself if sexual desire continues to arise after many years of practice. That's normal. It's more important is how you deal with it. Do you bring in mindfulness, reflect on it, work to let it go? Sometimes you have to endure it, of course, but then you let it go. If you're a monastic, you keep celibate, so it is the foundation of your practice. So sometimes you just have to be very patient, but your aim is always to bring up mindfulness, wisdom, reflect on letting go of desires for food, sexual desire, and so on. But don't judge yourself if they're still coming up sometimes. It's more prepare yourself in the way to reflect when they do come up. Many monks say, they've had maybe some person in their life that they were quite attracted to, somebody who could have become their wife or partner, say, and they ordain, and then for many years they notice that still in the back of the mind, and then one day it's gone. Maybe 10 years, 20 years. It's not usually one day or 10 days. It's usually in months, years. Finally, through working at it, contemplating the impermanence of people, lives, bodies, seeing the unattractiveness of the body, the mind changes and desire can drop away. And some monks have talked about this in their biographies or just in their teachings, how they had infatuation but then it faded through the practice. In the early days of your monk's life or nun's life, lust may come up quite strong, and you have to be very careful because you don't have the other qualities to manage it well. So there's a lot of stories of more junior Sangha members encountering a situation that brought up lust and just running to get out of there because they knew it was going to overwhelm them and be a problem in their practice, so they prefer just to get out of the situation until they're more steady in their practice. So that could be a monk living in a monastery somewhere and some member of the lay community continuously coming, and the monk keeps thinking about her and then starts to form thoughts of disrobing. Or sometimes it's strong, so like Lumpur Wen, when he was on Tudong, when he was a young monk, an astrologer said, one day when you're about 10 reigns or more senior, this beautiful girl with beautiful white skin, beautiful features will come from the east and threaten your monkhood. So he heard this like when he'd just been a monk a few years, and he thought, okay. And then he carried on his life, and many years nothing happened. But he remembered the words. I guess he was a bit concerned about the words. So they stuck in his mind. And then one day, many years later, he was with another monk, and they were walking through Laos, and they're on the banks of the Mekong River having a bath, I think, if I remember. And, the way you bath, you put a bath robe around you, and you splash around in the water and soap up whatever where you've got. And they were having their evening bath, and then this woman and her daughter came by in a boat. Whether they were just traveling or selling something, I don't know. They came by in the rowboat, and Lumpur Wen looked up, and the east of Thailand is the Mekong River, and then it's Laos. So they're in the east. He looked up, there's the mother, and then he saw the daughter. Oh, beautiful white skin, white features, very pretty. And their eyes met, and there was the electricity. Zoom. And Lumpur Wen said to his friend, the other monk, "That's it, we're off, get your stuff, we're going now." He didn't want to see her again, he didn't want to talk, because he knew, this is going to be trouble, pulling on the heartstrings. Lust can come up very strong, and if you don't yet have the samadhi or the insight to deal with it, well, sometimes it's better just to get out of there to protect your practice. There's many, many stories like this, but I just find that a funny one. And so they did. They just got their stuff together and they left, and they never went back there. End of story. So he never knew what happened to her. He just knew that this could be trouble for him. So there's different ways we deal with lust. So maybe that's enough for this session. There's still a few more questions left, which we'll continue with later. But for now, we're going to have a period of walking meditation to relax the body, energize ourselves after sitting in the heat of the day. So we'll end this session there.